Hello, and welcome to our continuation of our discussion on the supply and demand model in the market for goods and services. If you recall from the last video, we discussed exactly what is demand and what is supply. In this video, we're going to bring supply and demand together to discuss the equilibrium. So as you can see here, we have the quantity on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. Our demand curve is downward sloping, again because of the law of demand, and our supply is upward sloping. The point where demand and supply meet, we'll call this point A, is called the equilibrium. And this is where the decentralized decisions of all of our millions and buyers of sellers come together so that our buyers and our sellers are equally satisfied with what we call the market clearing price, or P star. This is the price that equilibrates the demand and supply. At the equilibrium quantity, Q star, quantity demanded is exactly equal to quantity supplied. So why do we need to have this particular price, P star? Why can't we have a different price? Well, what happens if the price is above the equilibrium price? At this point, we'll call this point P, the price is greater than the equilibrium price, P star. Here we have our supply, we'll call this S prime, and here we have our demand, we'll call this QD, or demand prime, and the corresponding quantity supplied and quantity demanded. At this point, we see that supply is greater than demand, and this results in a surplus. Therefore, to get rid of that surplus, what needs to occur is to have downward pressure on the price so that as the price falls, we have a movement along the supply curve and a movement along the demand curve to a point where demand is once again equal to supply. So to get rid of a surplus, we need to have downward pressure on the price. On the other hand, if we're faced with a situation where the price is below the equilibrium price, here is our demand, we'll call this D prime, and our quantity demanded, and here is our supply, S prime, and our quantity supplied. At this point, we see that our demand is greater than our supply, and we end up with a shortage in the market. To get to a point where we return back to the equilibrium, what we need to have is upward pressure on the price. So to get rid of a shortage, we need to have upward pressure on the price so that as the price starts to rise, supply increases and demand decreases, and we return to a point where once again demand is equal to supply. Okay, well, recall from the last video, we were discussing points and situations where we could have a shift in either demand or a shift in supply. Let's look at an example here so that we can understand exactly what would happen to our equilibrium if we have shifts in demand or shifts in supply. At this point, you can pause the video, try to work through the example yourself, and then come back to look at the answers and explanations with me. So here, let's consider the market for oranges. And we have the following table that shows us the price, quantity demanded, and quantity supplied. So we have a different combination of quantity demanded and quantity supplied at each price point. We want to draw out the supply and demand curves based on this information and determine where we have the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Then we want to consider what happens if we have an exceptionally cold winter in Florida that causes a frost that ruins many of the orange groves. We want to illustrate what happens in the market and analyze the new equilibrium. Then we want to analyze what happens if the price of apples falls. Okay, so let's get started. First, we want to determine where is the equilibrium price and quantity. This is going to occur, remember, where our quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So if we look at our table, we see that the point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied is when the price is equal to $3. So if we draw out our graph, we see that the market clearing price will be $3 and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 30. At this point, demand is equal to supply. Okay. So now we want to think about a situation where what happens if we have a frost in Florida. And this causes a ruin of orange groves. So let's think back to factors that would cause a shift in demand or a shift in supply. A frost that ruins many of the orange groves would be similar to a decrease in the number of orange sellers, because there are going to be less farmers that are able to provide oranges into the market. So therefore, we know that this is going to cause a shift in our supply curve. And which direction is it going to shift? It'll shift in or to the left. So what we observe is that at each price point, there's going to be a lower quantity supplied. So our supply curve is going to shift in. We move from an equilibrium point, such as point A, to a new equilibrium point, such as point B. We see that the price of oranges is going to rise up to P2 as we reach the new equilibrium point, point B, and the total quantity of oranges is going to decline. So in response to this frost, what we observe is that the price of oranges rises and the quantity of oranges that are available in the market is going to fall. Now, let's consider this second example. What happens if the price of apples falls? Remember, apples and oranges are considered substitutes. So a change in the price of a related good, such as apples, is going to affect the orange market. So if the price of apples falls, apples become cheaper relative to oranges, all else equal. So we know that consumers will now demand more apples and less oranges. So with the price of apples falling, the demand for oranges is going to decrease as people consume more apples. So what we observe, therefore, in our market is the demand curve shifts in or to the left. We move from an equilibrium such as equilibrium A to a point such as equilibrium B. And the result is a decrease in the price as we move to a point such as P2 and a decrease in the quantity as we move to a quantity such as Q2. So in response to the fall of apples, the fall in the price of apples, the price of oranges is going to decrease, and the quantity of oranges available is also going to decrease. So with these two examples, you're able to understand the dynamics of what happens in the supply and demand model when we have either a shift in supply or a shift in demand. When we're trying to decide what happens when we have changes in the market, it's important to first identify which curve shifts and why. Secondly, to determine in which direction it shifts. And lastly, to illustrate the change and analyze the new equilibrium. Thanks so much for joining me in this explanation of supply and demand and the market equilibrium.